Hi, I'm Hal Roberts. This is Bridge City News. Here's some of the top stories we've been following. It's Election Day in the United States. We have reaction from a few on a potentially historic day south of the border. Sun political columnist Brian Lilley discusses how damaging the Trudeau government's new emissions cap will be on the Canadian economy. And with Remembrance Day just around the corner, BCN's Heidi Echeverria visited the Bomber Museum in Nanton to hear more about the brave men and women in Canada's Air Force.
Your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News with Hal Roberts.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, it's Election Day in the United States. There are reports that pollsters are seeing record amounts of Americans coming out to vote in a number of states. Now, the Republican candidate for the U.S. presidency, Donald Trump, says he's encouraged by the amount of Republican supporters who've come out to vote so far.
No, I feel very confident. I have felt. We went in with a very big lead today, and it looks like Republicans have shown up in force. This election should be over. They spend all this money on machines. And frankly, if they'd use paper ballots, it would be over by 10 o'clock. Look, regrets, you always have regrets. I can't think of any, to be honest, to use her expression. I can't think of any. I ran a great campaign. I think it was maybe the best of the three. On the assumption I win, I don't know if something else happens. I don't know what's going to happen in terms of declaring victory. But if in normal times, I would go over to the convention center, let's say at 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock or something, but I just don't know. I certainly don't want any violence, but I certainly don't have to tell. These are great people. These are people that believe in no violence.
Meanwhile, there's a village in India where Kamala Harris has ancestral roots. Many in that region are praying for her to win.
எங்களுக்கு எல்லாருக்கும் சந்தோஷம் மகிழ்ச்சி அவங்க வெற்றி பெறணும்.
So will Americans vote for their very first female president, or will Donald Trump get back into the White House? Lisa Daftari is host of the Foreign Desk. She's also a U.S. political correspondent. She joins us now from Los Angeles to talk more about the U.S. presidential election. Lisa, did Trump and Harris do enough to win over voters in some of the key swing states such as Michigan and Nevada?
Well, that's what it's going to come down to, right? And it always does, which this time of year, every 4 years, we have the discussion about the Electoral College and how significant it is or whether we should do away with it. Of course, it's going to come down to a handful of states, and the two candidates are working it and trying to see. We're going to have our gender reveal, a lot of people say today. Will it be a female president? Will it be a male president? And hopefully we will have the results by tonight. But with all the mail-in ballots and all the votes that need to be counted afterwards, who knows, if we're going to have a decisive answer tonight as to whether or not we know who the next president of the United States is.
Many political experts say because the race is so tight, it may take a while before we know who the winner will be, especially if there are a number of recounts. Your thoughts?
It's going to be messy, and that's really the forecasting, right? The fact that there are ballots coming in from all different places. We've had ballots set on fire already. We already have people boarding up their businesses in certain parts of the country, particularly in Washington, D.C., expecting there to be some sort of protesting by either side. Look, this is exactly what people feared in such a messy political landscape, trying to figure out, who's going to be the next president, and such an emotional divide between Americans right now, and such a difference in ideology with the two of them, and really the entire future of the world. And not to sound so, super exaggerated, but it truly will be such a different path forward given each candidate's views towards foreign policy, towards the border, even towards domestic issues. So it is a very significant election. I know Trump has gotten some very important endorsements in the last 48 hours, but that vote against Trump, I'm not going to say it's a huge emotional draw to Kamala Harris, but that vote against Trump and a defensive vote against Trump is also very high, and people are feeling very emotional against that as well.
Lisa, you know politics, but you're also a foreign affairs expert. Do you believe a second Trump presidency will finally bring an end to many of the wars we're seeing, including Ukraine and Russia and Israel battling Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis? How about preventing China from invading Taiwan?
What we saw from the first Trump presidency was a lot of deterrence, just trying to keep everyone at bay. None of these wars started. Obviously, he has a bit of a more pro-Israel stance, given how he had the tariffs on China. He's very staunchly against letting all the people in from the border, which is another national security crisis. So a very different approach to foreign policy, to deterrence, to national security. And the most important fact of all, Hal, here is to look at our adversaries, and they're actually endorsing Kamala Harris, which is very unusual to see, states like the Iran regime have, a say in our election. That should tell us everything we need to know really about how different these two candidates will be with regards to dealing with our friends and our enemies abroad.
She is host of the Foreign Desk and U.S. political correspondent Lisa Daftari. Thanks again for joining us today from Los Angeles. And by the way, Jeremy Prest and David Craig from the TV program Citizen will be discussing the U.S. election and its impact on Canada. Watch for the live episode taking place 7 p.m. Mountain Time on Wednesday night. When it comes to which U.S. president may be better for the Canadian economy, it really doesn't matter. And that's according to Sun political columnist Brian Lilley. He says both Trump and Harris have protectionist policies that will hurt Canada, policies Joe Biden has already put in place. Now, a new poll suggests that Canadians would prefer Trump to be elected in the United States if Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives win our next election here in Canada.
Do I think Poilievre could actually handle Trump? I think so, because Poilievre is going to be looking at this from what helps Canadian jobs, what helps Canadian business, what helps the Canadian economy. And if you remember what Trudeau went into the NAFTA renegotiations with, what were his priorities? Gendered language and climate change. The Americans had all these requirements about getting better access to the Canadian market. We wanted gendered language.
Mr. Lilley will also discuss how the Alberta government is fighting back against the Trudeau government's latest production caps on our oil and gas industry. Details coming up later in our program. As you've heard on Bridge City News, the Trudeau government wants to impose an emissions cap of 35% less than the 2019 levels. Many argue that would be devastating to our oil and gas industry and negatively impact our economy. BCN's Naveen Day chatted with a researcher from the Montreal Economic Institute, Christelle Vidavrangel, about how the federal government's plan could hurt so many Canadians.
Crystal, how many jobs do you think this plan could cost Canadians?
Well, it's estimated that by 2040, over 113,000 jobs will be lost across this country, over 60% of which will be here in Alberta. So it will definitely be felt quite heavily in the province.
And where would these jobs go? Would they disappear completely or go to the US or overseas?
So these jobs, these Canadian jobs, either will be lost or won't be created here, meaning that the folks that would have been in these jobs will be unemployed or forced to find work in other less well-paying sectors. The oil and gas sector pays about 2.5 times the average Canadian wage. So this is quite a well-paying sector. And as global demand for oil and gas resources is not expected to decline, these jobs will be creeping up and cropping up in other countries to meet that growing demand. So we will be left kind of holding the bag on that.
That was Crystal Witte-Vrangel, the Director of Research at the Montreal Economic Institute, who joined us from Calgary.
Thanks so much, Naveen. Many regions of Alberta received snow today, including right here in Lethbridge. Jeanette Rocher is now with an early peek at the forecast. Jeanette, the white stuff may not be sticking around much longer here in southwestern Alberta, as things will be warming up quite a bit this week.
When you look at the forecast for later this week, you'd almost think we were talking about two different regions of the country, because we're going from snowy, rainy conditions today with the temperatures in the low pluses to mid-teen temperatures later in the week. Now, of course, today, that nasty day. This evening as well, looking at overnight periods of snow and an overnight low of -9 with a wind chill going to feel more like -17. Yeah, that's an ouch. And then as we get into Wednesday, we're seeing mainly sunny skies again, back up to 6 degrees. before getting into those mid-teen temperatures later on this week. And I'll be back later in the show to tell you all about that.
Great. Thanks so much, Jeanette. Recognizing Remembrance Day here in our country is a way to honor all of those who fought and died for our freedoms. Now, part one of this next report, BCN's Heidi Echevarria was at the Bomber Command Museum of Canada in Nanton, Alberta, to learn more about the brave battles our heroes fought in the air.
While many countries and their people were being killed by dictatorial governments, thousands of men sacrificed their life for peace and freedom. Among these brave men, the brilliant participation of the Canadian military and the Royal Canadian Air Force bomber crew must be recognized. Carol Gasgard, curator at the Bomber Command Museum of Canada in Nanton, Alberta, explains what is so important to have the historic place of the interest not only in Canada, but around the world.
It's important because the sacrifice is so huge. Out of 100 bomber crews that started out to do 30 combat trips, only 25% finished their 30 combat trips. 75% did not finish. So on our giant Bomber Command Memorial Wall out there are 10,800 plus names of the young Canadians that were killed in bombers. That's why we're here. Some 400 Lancasters were made in Canada and then flown to England to help with the war effort. As the war progressed, the Allies knew they needed 4-engine bombers, and so they manufactured the Halifaxes and the Lancasters and to some extent the Sterling bombers. And these were the heavy bombers that they used to pound the Nazi Empire into submission. You needed those long-distance bombers to destroy the factories and the supply networks, and that's why the two main bombers, I would say, for Canadian Bomber Command history are the Halifax and the Lancaster.
Canada not only played a huge role in the creation of hundreds of the Lancaster used in the World War II, but was the #1 nation in training more than 131,000 airmen.
Canada trained all the guys to fly in bombers in Canada, where no one was shooting at them. Pilots, navigators, to fly airplanes. We trained 131,000. The #2 nation called Australia. They trained 30,000. The British don't talk about it, the Americans don't talk about it, and the Canadians don't know. And the Canadians, for the years 1942, 43, and 44, did not fly the Lancaster. The Canadian squadrons flew the Halifax. That's why we're putting together a Halifax at the Bomber Command Museum.
Over 10,800 Royal Canadian Air Force bomber aircrew with an average of 23 years of age died during the Second World War, fighting for our freedom. As many say, freedom is not free. From the Bomber Command Museum of Canada, for Bridge City News, I'm Heidi Echevarria.
Thanks so much, Heidi. You know, in part 2 of Heidi's special report, she'll look into all of the Bomber Museum has to offer visitors from all over the world. This Remembrance Day, in addition to wearing a poppy and laying a wreath, you may want to definitely keep your eyes focused on the skies. A local pilot who restored an old warplane will be doing a flyby over the November 11th ceremonies in Stirling, Raymond, Coaldale, and Lethbridge. BCN's Jeanette Rocher has that story.
It never saw any action overseas, but this little bird was nicknamed the Pilot Maker. That's because in its heyday, this Harvard Mark IV was one of the aircraft that trained Canadian fighter pilots, so you could say it still did its part to help fight for world freedom. And this Remembrance Day, it will do its part to remind us all of those who were lost.
So I like to do it just as a tribute to everyone that served in the military. It's a privilege to be a custodian of these airplanes.
Its owner, Jeffrey Brain, purchased the plane several years ago and rebuilt it himself.
Well, I've always been an advocate of I love old airplanes. I love the history, particularly warbirds. We heard about this one. It was in a hangar in Tisdale, Saskatchewan. Been abandoned for 25 years. So we took it apart, trucked it home to Lethbridge, Spent about a year with some good friends and a good maintenance department here in Lethbridge, QL Aviation, and we restored it back to the way it was when it was retired in 1966.
You may have seen Brain and his Harvard over the southern Alberta skies. The past 4 Remembrance Days, it's done a fly past over the cenotaph during the November 11th ceremony. And this year is no exception.
We'll do Lethbridge, Sterling, Raymond, and Coaldale. We started doing it when we restored the airplane 4 years ago, and I was surprised. We flew it the first year, I think 2021, and the number of phone calls I got after we flew the Remembrance Day and people approaching us just how much it meant, because they had someone, some family member either flying the airplane or had worked on the airplane, an uncle. And so I realized it was significant for people to see a bit of history and a bit of a connection to family members.
His co-pilot this year is former Canadian snowbird and retired Captain David Deere, who served for 17 years flying fighter jets. He and Brian, together with the Hornet, will leave a contail in remembrance of those we should not forget. For Bridge City News, I'm Jeanette Rocher.
A former advisor to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was blasted by angry protesters yelling Allahu Akbar and who tried to storm his lecture hall October 31st at the University of Calgary. Eilon Levy took to X and wrote, "Canada, you're in big trouble. These are not political protests. These are jihadi war cries. Don't let this hateful extremism define Canada." Security guards who were verbally assaulted were posted outside the door where he was lecturing, preventing protesters from entering the facility. The Alberta government is investing $110,000 into a campaign titled Rat on Rats to help keep our province rat-free. For over 70 years now, Alberta has been known worldwide as one of the only habitable regions on Earth to successfully subdue an extensive rat population. Most of the effort has relied on the province's rat control program along the eastern border with Saskatchewan. Through this initiative, the province is hoping to keep the momentum and are asking residents to continue to report all possible rat signs and sightings. Last year, only 23 rat sightings were confirmed out of 450 reports. Well, I know in our backyard we don't have any rats, but lots of those field mice. And we also had lots of snow mixed with rain today in Lethbridge, but the moisture shall be leaving us fairly soon. A full look at the weather pictures on deck. A number of areas in central and northern Alberta received quite a bit of the white stuff. As for us here in southwestern Alberta and Lethbridge, it was a little rain mixed with snow on Tuesday. Jeanette Rocher is now with a full look at the weather picture. Jeanette, as for our snow, it shall be short-lived.
Yeah, short-lived is right. With the exception of some overnight periods of snow, we're back up to sunshine, clear skies for the rest of the week beginning tomorrow, Wednesday. So high 6 degrees that day, jumping up to 12 degrees on Thursday, up to 15 for both Friday and Saturday. Mainly sunny skies as we get to Saturday, rather. We're going to see a little bit of cloudy conditions. Mix of sun and cloud for both Sunday and Monday with highs of 8 degrees and 7 degrees respectively on those days. So I'm loving those teen temperatures because that means we're going to be well above average for this time of year. We're going to hit that high average tomorrow, as a matter of fact. Average high for this time of year, 6 degrees. Average low, -6. 22 was our record high on this day, happening back in 1975. And in 1959, it was a record low, which was -25 that day. Sun rose this morning at 8:28. Sunset tonight, this evening, 6:01. We're looking at 2 minutes shorter of daylight than we had yesterday. So 9 hours, 33 minutes to be exact. Tomorrow, Victoria, and high of 9 degrees. We're looking at mainly cloudy conditions there. Cloudy skies in Vancouver, clearing up later on in the day. Also some fog patches in some sheltered areas, mostly in the morning there. 9 for a high in Vancouver. 8, we got a pair of 8s there in both Edmonton and Calgary tomorrow with lovely clear skies. As we look to the rest of the prairies, we're seeing some windy conditions, 30 to 50K winds in pretty much all 3 of these major cities. Saskatoon sitting at 1 degree with clearing skies. Clearing skies later on in Regina, -2 only for the high, and 3 degrees for the high in Winnipeg with partly cloudy skies. As we look to the central part of the country, we're seeing some rain. So 60% chance of showers in Toronto, high of a lovely 21 degrees. 21 also in Ottawa, periods of rain there, and 40% chance of showers tomorrow in Montreal with a high of 20 degrees. I'm loving those 20s. Also, those three cities looking at 30 to 50K winds. Same with most of these maritime cities as well. 30 to 50 kilometer per hour winds, but mix of sun and cloud in Fredericton, high 19, 18 for the high in Halifax, a lovely 17 in Charlottetown. And we're looking at periods of rain tomorrow in St. John's with a high of 10 degrees. So there you have it. That's your forecast.
Business groups say the work stoppage at BC ports is the latest in a run of supply chain issues affecting our economy. Employers at most of the province's ports locked out their workers on Monday in a dispute involving around 700 unionized foremen. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce says labor disruptions are becoming too common and tarnish our country's reputation as a reliable trading partner. The disruption comes less than a year and a half after a strike at the same port lasted 13 days and just a few months following a countrywide work stoppage at Canada's two biggest railways. Canada's merchandise trade deficit narrowed to $1.3 billion in September. Now, Stats Canada says that compared with a revised deficit of $1.5 billion for August. Exports of metal and non-metallic mineral products fell as exports of silver, gold, and platinum decreased just over 15%. Exports of energy products also dropped 2.6% as lower prices weighed heavily on crude oil exports. Imports for September, meanwhile, fell 0.4% to $65.1 billion as imports of metal and non-metallic mineral products fell 12.7%. Now, here's a look at today's markets.
The TSX was up 131 basis points of the day to 24,387. The Dow was also up 427 points to 42,221. The S&P 500 was up 70 points to 5,782, and the Nasdaq was also up 259 points to 18,439. West Texas Intermediate oil was up 52 cents to $71.99 US per barrel. Natural gas was down 10 cents to $2.67 US. Gold was up $7.80 to $2,743 US an ounce, and silver was up 17 cents to $32.65 US an ounce. Feed wheat is at $8.38 per bushel, barley is at $6.29, canola is at $14.45, and corn is at $7.52 per bushel. Live cattle December contract were down 30 cents to $184.77. Feeder cattle November contract were down 20 cents to $246.15, and lean hogs December contract were down $2.10 to $81.12. And the Canadian dollar was up slightly over the past 24 hours and currently sits at 72.35 US.
Recapping one of our top stories, well, it's Election Day in the United States. Elections officials, along with voters, are reporting smooth operations at most voting stations in the United States. Now, will Americans elect their first female president in Kamala Harris, or will Donald Trump get reelected? Political experts say the race is very tight, and we may see a number of recounts in some of the swing states that are split right down the middle between the Republicans and the Democrats. So which candidate would be better for Canada? Is it Trump or Harris? Political reporter and Sun columnist Brian Lilley will give us his thoughts momentarily. Listen, when you see news happening in your community, be sure to send us an email at info@bridgecitynews.ca. Also visit our website anytime to check out a number of stories and interviews. The Trudeau government has started a new war with Alberta by demanding that the oil and gas sector slash emissions by 35% below the 2019 levels. Premier Daniel Smith and the federal Tories say this will devastate our economy. It's not good news. Now, to chat about this in more detail is political columnist with The Sun, Brian Lilley, who joins us once again from Toronto. Brian, no other oil and gas producing nation puts a production cap on their industry. How can the Trudeau government really justify this?
They're bragging about it. It was bizarre yesterday. I was watching Committee Hal, Natural Resources Committee, Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland's there, Jonathan Wilkinson, the Natural Resources Minister is there, and Shannon Stubbs, Alberta MP from Lakeland, asked that very question, and she detailed, OPEC countries don't do this, Norway doesn't do this, the UK doesn't do this, the United States doesn't do this. Can you tell me which country does. And Jonathan Wilkinson laughed at her dismissively. It was arrogance on full display. But earlier, Stephen Guilbeault, the environment minister, bragged, look, we're the only country doing this. This is great. Normally they sit there and they say, well, we have to do this or we have to do that. We have to adopt this policy or we can't trade, which is not actually true. But those are the arguments they make. This time they were bragging that we are the only major oil and gas producing country that's doing this. Now, I'll put it to you. You can believe that climate change is a complete hoax, or you can believe that climate change is an existential threat. Why is it that Canada has not really reduced our emissions, despite the carbon tax, the clean fuel regulations, all these different measures that we've taken, but the Americans and others have, while not having a carbon tax, without penalizing their own economy, their own workers, their own people? Our emissions have stayed relatively the same. Others have been able to bring them down without these draconian measures that hurt consumers, that hurt workers, that hurt the economy. The Trudeau government is just being ideological on this. It is a pure out-and-out attack on Alberta to try and win favor with progressives in Eastern Canada.
Brian, historically speaking, Alberta's had the support of many premiers in their fight against Bill C-69 or the No More Pipelines bill. Now, will other provinces have Alberta's back in this latest fight with Ottawa?
It was remarkable to see every premier, every jurisdiction, New Democrat, Liberal, Conservative, all come together to back Alberta on the fight against Bill C-69. And of course, that is effectively back before the courts again. And I would expect that most, if not all, would back Alberta on that. On this latest one, it's a bit more difficult. It might depend on how Alberta frames it, especially within a court case. Now, Premier Danielle Smith has talked about two things, bringing in a motion from the Sovereignty Act. My colleague Rick Bell at the Calgary Sun asking her about that at her news conference on Monday and what that would look like, but also a court challenge to this. That will take a while. Would depend on how they framed it. Of course, areas like Quebec, there's a certain part of the population that is definitely anti-oil. And you find that to a lesser degree, but still significant in Atlantic Canada. Here in Toronto, it's unfortunately not great, but outside of Toronto, within Ontario, there's a bit more support. So how does the Alberta government, how does Premier Smith frame this? I actually think that she could get some decent support based on, depending on the arguments that she uses, even in places like Quebec. I was looking at a column that she wrote when she was still in the media. It was back in 2021, I think, and she was writing in the Calgary Herald about pushing back against Yves-Francois Blanchet, who wanted a green equalization formula to punish Quebec, or to punish Alberta and reward Quebec. And she said, be careful what you wish for. If she plays to the jurisdictional issues and the fact that Section 92A of the British North America Act, or the Canadian Constitution Act 1867, states that provinces have exclusive jurisdiction over natural resources, she might be able to win some political favor, both from premiers, but also in places like Quebec. That has strong resonance with voters of the Bloc Québécois, voters of the Conservative Party federally, less so with people who vote Liberal. So I think that would be a smart move. You got a new premier in New Brunswick, a Liberal in Susan Holt, not sure where she's going to go. Wab Kinew in Manitoba, new premier, new Democrat, but I actually think he might get on board with this because he can see that there's problems with what the federal government is doing when it comes to jurisdiction.
Brian, isn't a lot of this a moot point? I mean, the emissions cap, Bill C-69 in the fight, because the Trudeau government's days are really numbered.
Well, these are regulations, and so they can move to enact them now. And you're seeing this already, Stephen Guilbeault warning the Bloc Québécois and the NDP, hey, don't vote us down or you're going to be responsible for not reducing emissions. And of course, the Bloc didn't start out as a left-wing progressive party, but it is now. And the NDP definitely is. And we don't want to be against emissions, even if it means killing off 150,000 jobs Remember when the NDP was about blue collar jobs, when it was about working men and women and protecting their livelihoods? Well, they've all long abandoned that. And so they can do two things with this. One, they can move forward on this without going through Parliament, which isn't functioning now, but they don't need Parliament to do this. They just need to impose regulations. That doesn't require a vote. That's the bureaucrats doing this. Secondly, they are already using this to try and extend the life of this lame duck government. So they're trying to put pressure on the Bloc and the NDP and any progressives. Don't you dare go offside of us, or you're against the planet. Remember, it's always, if you don't agree with Justin Trudeau, you want the planet to burn, as Mark Holland said about your summer road trip.
Brian, it appears as though the new emissions caps don't apply to refineries, which means they won't impact imported oil brought into places like the Irving refineries in New Brunswick. In your opinion, is this just another example of favoritism by the Trudeau Liberals?
It's just like the home heating oil exemption all over again. Well, we've got a bunch of seats in Atlantic Canada. Let's not do anything that can hurt votes there. Let's not do anything that will annoy the Irving family. By the way, they're not as powerful as they used to be. They're still very powerful, but they used to own all the print media in New Brunswick. They don't. They sold it off actually to the parent company of where I work, the Toronto Sun and Post Media. So they don't have that leverage anymore, but still a very powerful political family, the Irvings, still an area where the Liberals hope to win jobs. And so, the Irving refinery, which, by the way, they would like, I'm not picking on the Irving family or Irving Oil, they would like to take Alberta oil and even bitumen from the oil sands and refine it and export it. They can't because of the policies of the Trudeau government. But right now, what are they doing? They're bringing in oil from everywhere else. So they can bring in oil from Nigeria, from Saudi Arabia, from the United States, wherever, refine it there, and these same caps will not apply. So, it's mind-boggling that they would do that, but it's par for the course for the Trudeau Liberals, who have one goal in mind, that is retaining power. Look, they're going to lose George Halal's seat in Calgary. There's a good chance they're going to lose Randy Boissonnault. That will go either NDP or it will go Conservative in the next election. They are going to lose whatever little foothold they have in your province. But, at this point, they don't care. They're trying to save the furniture with people in Toronto, in Montreal, and Atlantic Canada.
Brian, Americans are choosing a new president. Now, a recent poll suggests that Canadians think Justin Trudeau is better suited to deal with Kamala Harris if she wins, but also that Pierre Poilievre is better suited to work with Donald Trump. At the end of the day, Brian, neither Trump nor Harris are good for the Canadian economy due to their protectionist approaches when it comes to policy.
Well, that's been my viewpoint for the last several years. In fact, I was looking up a column that I wrote for the 2020 election on Joe Biden. And his protectionism, because back in the 2020 election, everyone was saying, "Oh, Donald Trump's going to be protectionist. We can't support him." Well, Joe Biden got in. He increased softwood lumber duties. He increased the Buy American provisions within the Federal Transit Agency, and that's an agency that will do things like fund bus systems or light rail. But you've got to Buy American, and they keep increasing the amount, and that hurts jobs in Canada, whether it's the New Flyer factory in Manitoba or the Alstom train plant in Thunder Bay, Ontario. These are things that hurt the Canadian economy. Now, does it necessarily mean that if there's a Democrat in the White House, having a Liberal in Ottawa helps? Not necessarily. Biden has brought in all kinds of protectionist measures. He tried to wipe out our auto industry again with the Inflation Reduction Act. The critical minerals that are huge up in Northern Ontario and other parts of the north of this country, the Inflation Reduction Act states that they must be sourced or processed in the United States to get all kinds of tax credits. These are protectionist measures all over. And as I already mentioned, softwood lumber and elsewhere, the country of origin labeling for beef and pork producers. Biden goes on, and Trudeau has had very little success in dealing with it. Do I think Poilievre could actually handle Trump? I think so, because Poilievre is going to be looking at this from what helps Canadian jobs, what helps Canadian business, what helps the Canadian economy. And if you remember what Trudeau went into the NAFTA renegotiations with. What were his priorities? Gendered language and climate change. The Americans had all these requirements about getting better access to the Canadian market. We wanted gendered language.
You know, Brian, as the Trudeau government promised to curtail immigration levels, a new report shows that the federal government did not even monitor the impact of temporary foreign workers on the job market or on keeping wages low. What can you tell us?
So this is an internal departmental report where they acknowledge that, yes, they did all these labor market assessments to be able for a firm, let's say that Bridge City News decided, okay, we've got these 4 positions. We can't fill them locally. We need to hire a temporary foreign worker. You need to get what's called a labor market impact assessment. What will the impact of bringing in these foreign workers have on the labor market in Lethbridge? Well, so you do that, and they say yes or no based on the assessment that you get, but then they don't monitor it. And so they approve assessment after assessment after assessment. And then the questions were raised, well, are we looking at what this is doing to the labor pool, to the labor market? Are we looking at what it's doing to wages? And the answer was no. The Prime Minister has already said that in certain sectors, the temporary foreign workers program has suppressed wages. Mike Moffat, an economist who has advised the Trudeau government on many different files, has looked at this program, looked at the impact, and said, this is a wage suppression program. These are not good metrics for any government to have, especially not one that claims to be progressive, looking out for the middle class and those working hard to join it.
Brian, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre says he wants to cut the GST from home prices under $1 million, but the Trudeau government is warning that could take away funding for cities. So let me ask you, who's right here?
They're both right. Pierre Poilievre says, yeah, let's cut the GST for homes under $1 million. And look, if you're in Vancouver or Toronto, that won't get you a big house, but it's on new builds, by the way. It's only on new builds, not on existing homes, because the GST doesn't apply to existing home sales. And this is what the buyer pays at the end, not what the builder pays throughout and gets the claim back. This is a separate act of the GST being applied. And Poilievre says, look, this can save $40,000, $50,000 for an average new buyer in British Columbia or Ontario. This is a really good move, and we should do it. It will make homes cheaper. And by the way, it'll make homes cheaper in Lethbridge. It'll make homes cheaper in Canmore, wherever this is happening. This would work. The question was, well, how will you pay for that? And he said, I'll cut some of these other programs, including the Housing Accelerator Fund. And the Liberals scream, but that's money for cities. Poilievre has been going on social media and pointing to how many millions the Trudeau government has given certain cities and how home starts have actually gone down. So the federal government's giving money for a housing accelerator fund that's supposed to get government, make it easier to build, and it's not happening. The problem with housing, there's many, but the taxation, whether you're talking about the GST on a new home, the development charges, the ancillary fees charged by government, here in Ontario, the estimate is it's about 1/3 of the cost of a home is to taxes. 1/3 how? And I'm sure it's the same in other jurisdictions. That becomes untenable. It makes housing unaffordable. Poilievre, I think, has the right idea of getting government out of the way rather than, as he says, building a bureaucracy to feed another bureaucracy, which doesn't build more homes.
Political columnist with The Sun, Brian Lilley, thanks so much for joining us today from Toronto.
Thank you, Hal.
Remembrance Day, lest we forget, it's a time to remember the many sacrifices paid by our soldiers to allow us to enjoy the freedoms we have today. And it's also a time to review how our society and government treats veterans and their families. Joining me now is Wayne King, a retired Canadian Forces Colonel and Service Officer for the Lethbridge Royal Canadian Legion. Good to have you with us once again, Wayne. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much for having me, yes.
Absolutely. Okay, so Wayne, when did you first enlist in the armed forces and what motivated you to get involved? I see you're quite decorated there.
Yes, I joined the Royal Canadian Air Force in 1959, and my motivation was probably very similar to that of young men at the time. I wanted to participate in supporting our society. I certainly hoped that I would be able to pursue a flying career, which fortunately I was able to do, and never looked back from that time.
Right. And, of course, war is never something on our wish list, but, it happens. Of course, many believe that it's necessary at times. Can you talk about the importance of fighting for freedom?
I think all we have to do is think back to the circumstances that existed, for example, during World War II, the horrendous situations that were being imposed upon various peoples within Europe, the programs to eliminate basically the Jewish nation from Europe, and the desire on the part of at least one of the warring nations to gain territory, to increase their posture in the world and to dominate other nations. Sometimes it becomes necessary to stand up for your rights, stand up for your beliefs. And unfortunately, that leads to war.
Yeah, it is unfortunate. You mentioned you enlisted in 1959, so that would have been obviously after World War II, but did you see any action at all with any of the other wars that were taking place?
Well, yes, I was quite close to a number of armed activities. I did participate briefly in some of the activities in Vietnam. I was at the time seconded or serving with the United States Air Force, and I was in Vietnam very briefly, fortunately, but nonetheless, I was firsthand witness to what was going on there.
I can't imagine some of the things you saw.
Well, yes, war is never a pleasant activity, that's for sure. Anybody who's ever been involved certainly very quickly comes to the appreciation that it's to be avoided if at all costs, but sometimes it just can't be avoided.
Yeah, that's true. One of our producers had read that during the First World War, Lethbridge had the highest per capita enlistment of soldiers anywhere in Canada. So has Southern Alberta always been supportive of veterans?
Southern Alberta has always been very supportive, very generous in its support of the veteran community. In our current situation, the current laws that exist, Freedom of Information Act and so on, there's no way I can give you an accurate count of the number of veterans either within Lethbridge or within the surrounding area. However, I would personally estimate those to be in the order of 2,000. But the people of Lethbridge have been very generous in their support and continued involvement with the veteran community. There's no question about it.
Yeah, and 2,000, that is a pretty large number, especially for such a small city like this. Now, of course, this is the time of year where we all wear our poppies, and sometimes little kids might ask, why do people wear this red flower pin every year in November? Can you share a little bit about the history and the importance of the poppy?
Well, the poppy came about many, many years ago, and it became a symbol of remembrance, a symbol of recognition of the sacrifice and the contribution of those in uniform and others in our community who were heavily involved in the war effort. And it is a very important symbol for all of us to display because it does signify remembrance and acknowledgement of the sacrifice of those in uniform some who gave their lives in defense of our freedoms, but others who certainly served and were equally impacted in many ways in the support of our society.
Mm-hmm. How do you think we're doing this year compared to others when it comes to the number of people actually wearing poppies? Are the numbers up or down?
Well, I'm always disappointed when I go out in public and see the number of people displaying the poppy, I would like to think that, particularly at this time of year, that the poppy would certainly have a very significant presence in our society. Unfortunately, that's not true. I've been out and about on a daily basis, and I find the older generation, by and large, are more prominent in their display of the poppy. As the society gets younger and younger, the number wearing the poppy is fewer and fewer, and certainly on a broad basis, we're looking at definitely less than 10% on any given moment who actually wear the poppy. And at the Legion, we very strongly advocate the wearing of the poppy. The poppies are available at no cost. We're grateful for any contribution or any donation to the support of veterans, but the poppy itself, there is no cost, and they're readily available, and we would encourage everybody to wear them.
Yeah, and like you said, they're free, so everyone should be wearing them. You mentioned also a donation. Where does that money go?
The money goes to what we call the Poppy Fund. It is a fund Canada-wide and first localized at the branch level and then administered through various command structures. Each province has its own command structure, and then Dominion Command have established criteria on the use of the Poppy Fund in support of veterans. And as long as the use of those funds adheres to the rules laid down, then it can be used in direct support of veterans or those organizations supporting veterans.
Wonderful. You mentioned that when you're out and about, you see people wearing the poppies. It's generally the older generations, and as you look to the younger ages, you see it less and less. It kind of surprises me because I think the schools definitely do their part with teaching the young kids. But how well are we doing with younger generations remembering? And do we need to do more to help our kids appreciate the sacrifices made for our freedoms?
We need to do whatever we can to ensure that our younger generations are well aware of the sacrifice of their parents, grandparents, and other members of their families in support of our freedoms. But I am heartened by virtually every school having ceremonies either immediately prior or within the few days of Remembrance Day. And that is one opportunity to bring the sacrifices to the minds of the younger generation. We must always remember, because as the adage goes, if you fail to learn the lessons of the past, you are bound to repeat them. And unfortunately, in today's world, we're at risk, very grave risk of international upheaval.
Now, what kinds of needs and challenges are older veterans facing right now, Wayne?
Well, the needs of the veteran community are wide-ranging, and it depends on the experience of the individual veteran in service. When we talk about veteran disabilities and so on, we must remember that it's not only those who suffered a disability during a time of active warfare, but also in the so-called peace years. I question the use of peacetime because in many respects, it is a war. We have to be prepared for war to prevent war. And but the needs vary a great deal. Those suffering from disabilities such as PTSD and so on are equally disadvantaged, and in many cases more so than those who have suffered loss of limb or eyesight, as an example. And the needs vary from ongoing medical support to full care in many cases.
Yeah.
So it's varied, but very real to the veteran community.
Yeah, and you mentioned PTSD there, and we hear these stories of veterans struggling with it. And so, what would you like to see changed in the way help is being offered to these situations and these veterans suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder?
During the last number of years, the amount of support being provided by the Department of Veterans Affairs and so on has increased significantly. But we must always remember that there is a degree of bureaucracy involved, one which makes it difficult in some cases for the veteran to access the support that's available, or at least to understand the programs that are available. The support is there, but sometimes access to it lacks the speedy application that we'd like to see.
What would you say to a young person watching right now who might be considering a career in the armed forces?
I must admit that my view of the military and the value of the military life dates back now many decades. It's a different world now with the technology available to our society and so on. A technology that wasn't even thought of when I first joined, let alone be available. I would, however, continue to advocate that the youth of our community certainly seriously consider a role or an active participation in the military, if not in the regular services, then through the reserves. The benefits are enormous: self-discipline, training, education, and so on. And I think it's well worthwhile. I would suggest to the society as a whole that our military right now is very, very vulnerable to any armed conflict. We have gone through a number of years where the governments of the day have decided not to come up with adequate funds to equip the military, to enable the military to man its various responsibilities, and to prepare not only the military, but also our society in general for conflict, which unfortunately over time will be on our doorstep.
Yeah. Are there any areas that you'd like to see the government spend more money on, since you think that our soldiers aren't currently properly equipped?
Well, just to give you a couple of examples, okay. When I retired, or in the time that I was thinking about retiring, I was part of the staff officers in Ottawa who was commenting on the next generation of aircraft, fighter aircraft, the Air Force. That was in the late 1970s. And the aircraft was the F-18. Well, that was the aircraft we bought. But and we're still flying it 50 years later. The grandchildren of the officers who participated in the analysis of Canada's need at the time are the active pilots on those aircraft. Grandchildren are flying them. That kind of hardship, or that kind of lack of updated military equipment, is true also of the Army and of the Navy.
Yeah, it's a little scary when you think about it.
Well, right now, Canada is undermanned for our responsibilities. We are under-equipped, under-trained, and I fear to say we are unprepared for what may come down the road and face us.
That's a sobering, it's a sobering thought for sure.
Yeah, it's time that the country came to the table and started to put the monies required. The country formally agreed to the NATO request of minimum levels of funding, and we have failed to meet that consistently. And our budgets, quite frankly, now would have to be doubled just to meet the absolute minimum required by the agreement that the country has undertaken.
Oh, that's terrifying. And of course, a reminder that Remembrance Day is November 11th. There's a number of ceremonies, Remembrance Day ceremonies taking place throughout the country, including here locally. Can you remind our viewers about attending local Remembrance Day events? What, when, and where?
There will be two ceremonies in Lethbridge. The first and largest will be at the exhibition grounds. If you wish to attend, that is always well attended by the people of Lethbridge. I would suggest that you be present there at about 10:30 in the morning, and the ceremony will commence at about 10:45. There will also be a ceremony at the cenotaph itself, again starting at about 10:40 in the morning, and at the cenotaph you'll have the opportunity to see the flypast by the Globemaster aircraft flown by 49 Squadron, and that is the squadron, by the way, that the city of Lethbridge adopted during World War II. So there is a long history between the men and women of 49 Squadron and the city of Lethbridge. And those two ceremonies are happening at the same time, but I would strongly encourage all who are able to attend at least one of those.
Yeah, there we go. Sounds good. Wayne, we're out of time, but thanks so much for being with us today. Appreciate you as always.
Thank you very much.
Wayne King is a retired Canadian Forces Colonel and Service Officer with the Lethbridge Royal Canadian Legion. I'm Jeanette Roche on behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News. Thanks so much for watching.